Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to this panel. And before we start, I want to introduce the panelists. What we're going to be talking about today is artificial intelligence. And we've joked, and I've joked with Michael as well as others, we sort of get these buzzwords in cybersecurity space where we hear people talk about these words without really understanding what they mean or feeling that we have found the holy grail, whether it's blockchain, cryptocurrency, machine learning, artificial intelligence. But there is a real opportunity in this space with artificial intelligence. And we have a tremendous panel here to talk through it. We've got 30 minutes, so we're going to get right into some questions after I do the introductions and then look forward to some questions from the audience as well. I'll start with Sarah right here, and I think, am I the first to introduce you in your new position? So Sarah, as of last Friday, is the former chief at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. She's now CEO of Lightfeather, so I should give you the opportunity to pitch your own small business, economically disadvantaged women-owned small business, and it's great to have you here, your experience now in government and now in the private sector. Next to Sarah is Neil Chowdhury, who's Director of Systems and Innovation at the Office of Trade in the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Great to have you here. And at the end is Kristen St. Peters, who's the Deputy Associate Director for Capabilities at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So as you can see, we've got a terrific lineup of people, and we're really looking forward to the conversations. When we talk about, well, as I said, we'll get right into questions, and I encourage you also, this is a dialogue, and because we don't have a ton of time, I want to engage your thoughts and your questions on these issues, because there's certainly a broad range of what they are and what we could talk about. But when we look at artificial intelligence, we've talked a lot about how it can reshape traditional business functions like supply chain, human resources, finance, et cetera. And the question that I have for the panel, and we'll start with you, Sarah, is does this make sense for government? Are these transformations that we often talk about for artificial intelligence and we see happen in the commercial sector, are they possible in government to happen in that same way? And if so, what do you think helps make them happen? And if not, what are your concerns?
So I'm actually going to speak to my former experience, since Friday was the last day, that I was the division chief over the Identity Records and National Security Division. And yes, it's 100% possible, and we actually built it at USCIS, and the team will continue to thrive and run that without me. But we used machine learning in numerous different use cases. We built and are building a text analytics solution that identifies plagiarism in affidavits. We also built, actually built a person-centric service that used machine learning modeling for searching and entity resolution and deduplication of all of our identity data for benefit applicants. And then we had other solutions that we also built and maintained, and we used very modern technologies and machine learning models within AWS to do this. And very quickly, the text analytics solution we had up and running for a prototype in about 4 to 6 months. And the PCS system we built in a year.
Neil, because I'll go back, I have some privacy questions as well with that. But let's get it.
So I'm in the Office of Trade. It's a fun place to be. You know, it's we do good things for the American people, taxpayers. We collect about $120 million in revenue a day for the government. Thank you. So what we're talking about is the space that my organization is in is called the post-entry space. So that means a container has already cleared the port, you know, the stuff has already been sold, distributed before we get involved. And what we typically do is we look at internal controls and regulatory compliance programs of all the companies. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we do see that in a couple of companies. And what we start to see, especially when we talk about compliance, is causation correlation problems with artificial intelligence, where a lot of folks are building their biases into that artificial intelligence, right? So when I look at government implications. I mean, when we talk about the scope of what U.S. Customs and Border Protection does, we talk about, correlating people with places, with things and instruments, right? You draw the wrong correlations. It's not something that, hey, now instead of, it's not a recommendation engine on a e-commerce platform where risk is low. You draw the wrong correlations, people's lives are impacted. So it's something that we take very seriously, and it's this, we have to, in my opinion, we have to go a little slower. We can't be on the bleeding edge of things, at least till we know that the market has proven the technologies and that the government has the capacity to absorb that model in a secure manner that also protects people's personal expectations to privacy and their implicit contract with the government. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Okay.
So I'm sorry. When I introduced all the panelists, I should have brought Nick up here as well. But Nick Saki here is with Pure Storage, one of our very proud partners as part of this. So I just wanted to make sure he was up here and part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Sorry about that.
That means we'll give you the hard questions. Go ahead, Kristen.
I think you can handle them. Good morning, everybody. Really great to be here. So NGA, for those of you who don't know, we're the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. We have 3 pretty big missions. Combat support, so we support the warfighter intelligence, we support the intelligence community. Also, we do humanitarian assistance, disaster relief all over the world. So there's a lot of information that comes at us from many different types of sensors. And I think the best use case that I can compare it to is the financial markets, right? In financial markets, you have an analyst that takes a lot of financial data from a company. They take media reporting, they take open source information, they take public sentiment information. I'm not necessarily saying that we use all this data, but it's you have to integrate a lot of different types of data and determine whether a company is going to be profitable, right? For us, within the bounds of privacy and civil liberties, we take a lot of different types of data from different types of sensors, platforms, some space-based, some airborne, some open source, but again, we are very cognizant of privacy and civil liberties, and we have to figure out what is a threat, and how do we support the warfighter in a place like Afghanistan or Syria. So all of this data needs to be culled through. I think we are all dealing with big data problems, and so we use, for NGA's purposes, automation, artificial intelligence. What that means is we need to develop really good, really precise algorithms to be able to cull through big stacks of data. And then as you start to build those algorithms on top of each other, that's when you start to get into the really interesting insights that one would start to label artificial intelligence. So that's how we use it.
So, Nick, the question was, when we look at artificial intelligence, we talk about how it can transform human resources, finance, et cetera. And is that actually true to its full extent in government? And are there any downsides to the government use of artificial intelligence?
I have to agree with the panelists so far. The fundamental problem that we continue to have to address are the 4 V's of big data: volume, velocity, veracity, and variety. We have, in previous panel discussions today, discussed that we have an increasing tsunami of data, and it's wave after 60-foot wave crashing on the beach. We have run out of people to process this data, but we're collecting this data because there is information in there that we need or that we want to use in order to help us govern more effectively, execute our agency missions more effectively, reduce risk, ensure success. And yeah, artificial intelligence absolutely has the capacity, the potential at the very least, to deliver on the ability to process that data, to give us the insight and relevance to help us make smart, timely, and relevant decisions. Neil rightly pointed out, an artificial intelligence is just as prone to bias as any other intelligence. I mean, we are essentially programming them to function like we do, and rest assured that based off of the data that they see, they will start to think certain things are greater tendencies than others. We're going to have to be very mindful of this as we go forward. The other part is, what do we want to know? And that, because the government is so vast and its functions are so diverse, one AI is not going to solve everybody's problems. So I think that the themes from the previous two panels are very relevant. How do we start collaborating and working together to develop capability that is portable and useful in other areas to help us get at this big 4V problem that will continue to bedevil us. There is no small data in government. All data is big data. Anyway.
So you raise an interesting point about artificial intelligence that we think through a lot, which is how the biases come together. And I think we should talk about ethics in a moment. But when we look at data, I think arguably right now, particularly in critical infrastructure and certainly in government, data is the greatest asset. It's the most important asset. It's hard sometimes to make that point to companies, but they understand that regardless of what you do, the data you're collecting is your critical asset. So when you have all this data and the magnitude of data, I think one of the challenges with government, I know in talking with the government privacy officer in the Obama administration, he would talk about the need to just do purge days because there's so much data that's getting collected that we come across the data privacy issues. So ironically, the amount of data doesn't lead to what artificial intelligence is seeking to do, which is agility. You're trying to create agility in the structure. So how are you dealing in your various roles with the privacy issues around the data that's being collected and how that's feeding into AI? To Neil's point about biases and all of that. I think, Sarah, we can start with you.
Sure. We had privacy officials, actually, and still have, embedded with our teams and working with us every step of the way. And so the attitude was, how can I enable Sarah to do these unique and forward-leaning things so that we can provide a better service to the benefit applicants and to our internal stakeholders, and we can do our jobs more effectively and more accurately. And that's really what we were doing through all of our automation and machine learning, was improving our ability to process and meet our mission goals. And so, but the privacy officials, they were embedded. It was all about securing the data. Everybody had that same focus in mind. What are the rules that we need to use in order to secure our data? I come from an IT security background. I spent many, many years in this field and worked within the IT security division for many years, along with several of the people that I stole from there. And so we always built everything with IT security in mind. And we built a very strong IT security foundation where everything is automated in our environment. All the scanning, testing, it's all as a part of the pipeline and done daily. We have pen testers, we have encryption on everything, which is your key. We built a crypto delete solution, which is sanitization of data in the cloud and ensuring that it's really deleted. Security was always at the foremost thing that we're thinking about when we're building anything. So that was how we approached that.
And where we often get jammed a little bit with security, and particularly in the commercial space, is when we think we've got a solution that is foolproof. And the idea that, it's going to be completely secure. And we hear those pitches. It's that, yep, we've got it locked. But there's always a way to identify that vulnerability. So
let me say just one other thing there. And on that, it's an iterative process, just like anything else. It's a layered and iterative thing. You're not going to just have the solution in one day and then, okay, I'm done. That's not what it is. It's, I'm going to do the best I can today, and then tomorrow I'm going to add to that and make it even better. And the same thing, that was the same approach we used with the security folks. They were embedded in, and it was a constant improvement process, always adding more layers. Anil said something earlier outside. He's like, oh, what if you did it this way? And I'm like, that's an excellent idea. Yeah. Then add that to it, So go ahead.
So Neil, as you go through your processes, you can answer that question as well, but also thinking through what are your concerns from a privacy perspective when you talk about the numbers for what you're doing? I mean, you have a big role, and looking at the impact that it has. Do you have security concerns with AI, and how are you seeking to manage them?
So what I think of myself, I don't pretend to be a developer. I never have been a developer, right? When we talk about the folks that are really good with bits and bytes, that's not me. I sort of define myself as a solution engineer who understands technology, right? And I'm the guy in between translating the technology to the problem. So where my role comes in, we start with this idea of how do we reduce the cycle of innovation, right?
Yep.
When my boss comes to me and says, I see these private companies doing all these great things, why aren't we doing these? Right? We got Amazon that can do amazing analytics. We got other companies that are doing amazing space, right? Why aren't we doing it? So we say, okay, let's start with this DevOps model, right? Let's go to Agile. Let's go to the word du jour, right? And ultimately, we'll get these teams put together, and then we say, all right, we're ready to implement this solution. And then folks will come back on the back end and say, well, yeah, if you do this, these are the 5 laws you will break. Okay? And then it sort of stops the conversation, and you're sitting in governance committees for the next year and a half. So the approach that I have taken, especially in my last role as Associate Director for Enterprise Analytics Modeling and Simulation, is that we started to talk about SecDevOps, right? Where we put the privacy and the legal folks at the forefront. Mm-hmm. And what you tell them is, these are my requirements. Where do you see the privacy implications? Where do you see the problems with conflicting statutes, with conflicting regulations? We work those pieces out. Now we have a really well set group of requirements, and then we tell the coders, go code. Right? And that has definitely shortened the time to innovate. So that's really, at the end of the day, everybody comes in, I want AI. And then you go back and say, do you really want AI to identify where you breathe, eat, sleep, your political views, all that? And they're like, whoa, that's not what I want. I just want to catch bad guys. So that's where we talk about putting SecDevOps as a development model on the forefront.
Before I ask Kristen about the privacy issue, I have one follow-up question. So what happens in this space, the newer buzzword now is the cloud, and there's certainly a belief that bringing things to the cloud, particularly for small businesses, is really important. But when you talk about the role of AWS and Azure, and you look at these functionalities, and Kristen, I think it would be great to get your perspective on this as well, we in some ways are deferring some of the responsibility of that security to those cloud companies. How are you in government looking at the security of the cloud from that perspective? And I guess maybe I'll put that, Kristen, I'll ask that to you first, and then you can do the data privacy, and then we'll go back, because I saw Sarah pick up her, so this might elicit a little bit more conversation.
Sure, so it's all about the contract, right? I mean,
Spoken like a good government officer.
Well, and a lawyer. So
yeah, exactly.
to Anil's point, you want to talk about being having the legal team first and foremost. I am responsible for the IT shop, and I am a lawyer. So I have had to learn, as a lot of my colleagues have had to learn, a lot about technology. And I have a background of being forward deployed in the Middle East for a very long time, most of my 30s, in fact. So you have to, as a government officer, be willing to learn new things. And the technology part is, it's everybody has to understand and be conversant and be comfortable with it. Not just, I can't write Python, but I sure as heck understand how that process works in an agile environment. Yeah. And so I think bringing everybody with all of their collective skill sets into this is important. But to your question about privacy, obviously we're concerned about that. Cloud security is critically important. For us, you have to think about, what data am I ingesting? And we're very cognizant of what data is coming into our process, right? So if you are smart and mindful about the type of data you're ingesting, your privacy and your civil liberties start to ameliorate that concern. And then, as Sarah very, very astutely pointed out, it's a very layered, iterative process. There's a human component, there's a technology component, and then there's a partner component. And all of these three things need to be working together. And some days you got to be good at every day, and you got to keep working at it. It's not one of those things that you can let atrophy, because the technology changes and the adversaries, frankly, get better, and the new data streams change, and you need to really understand what that data is.
Nick, I'd love for you to get that to answer that question, but as a layered approach. are you worried about, because you referenced Neil's point about the biases, and when you look at the security, do you worry about the human, so what we've often talked about is the human to human. There are places where human to human makes sense, places where machine to machine makes sense. Sometimes we inappropriately put human to machine. And so what are you seeing in that space, and how does that impact the privacy of the data?
Technology is always designed to enable us to be more effective and more efficient human beings. It is a tool, whether it's a hammer or a rock or a bespoke IT infrastructure for doing data analytics. Everything that we're doing is designed to literally help us accelerate the continuum of knowledge. Data is all the stuff we collect. Information is data that's actually relevant to what we're trying to do. Intelligence is about the problem we're trying to solve. And finally, when we take that data and ultimately translate it into knowledge, it's designed to allow us to perform our functions and achieve our objectives, and forms the basis of how we make decisions about how to do that. Now, security, I spent 10 years as a intelligence analyst, and then ultimately I helped build IT solutions for Army Intel. Privacy and civil liberties is for real, but security policy is also extraordinary. And I used to tell my architects and my engineers, look, the security policy is our building code. We can't get a certificate of occupancy or an authority to operate if we violated this. So don't step outside the building code and don't expect any exceptions. But that does mean we talk to the ISSAs first, and we talk to the legal guys first and say, what are the boundaries here? And build inside of that. Now, one of the things that I think artificial intelligence is going to give us the opportunity to do, and the advents and improvements in networks, compute, and storage, is have AIs actually start triaging a lot of data for things like privacy issues, for things like PII. Hey, as it's iterating through these vast quantities of data, it's going to see things that the thousands of eyeballs that we put in front of it simply couldn't get to fast enough. So that technology is going to enable us to start being very targeted about the types of data that we permit in and out, as well as permitting access to that data.
So we're going to be running out of time shortly, and I want to get into some audience questions, but I do have one final question, which is two-pronged, which means you can answer both or just choose your own adventure. When we look at artificial intelligence, we look at government. One of the biggest challenges for government has been legacy infrastructure. Does AI help with legacy infrastructure? And the other piece to this is when we also talk about, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure, the ability of government and industry to work together more effectively in this era of cybersecurity. Does AI help facilitate that collaboration in ensuring that government offers something in the relationship as well as the private sector? So we'll start with the original order. Sarah.
I'm not a huge fan of legacy infrastructure, so.
I don't think anybody is.
I mean,
do you think it helps? I mean, is there an opportunity for AI to play a role in cybersecurity with legacy infrastructure?
I mean, sure. You can hook up, scanning technologies and audit logging technologies to correlate data that comes from legacy technologies, legacy infrastructure, and then analyze and troubleshoot and do other things, and like this gentleman said, find security issues and issues with your data breaches and stuff like that. But it's not, I mean,
do you think it can overcome it though? I mean, so the issue that
I think it's two separate things. I really don't. I don't see them as like a
from a cybersecurity perspective.
No, not really. I mean, I don't see it that. I mean, you pulling data and then looking at it doesn't really matter where it comes from, right? Like, I mean, you can use AI to look for cybersecurity purposes to look at data that comes from anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's legacy or if it just really doesn't. It's like doesn't matter, right? Like that point isn't. It doesn't really correlate, it's like saying, can you drink water from a glass or a cup? Does the glass or the cup really matter? Well,
but doesn't it in this area, when you're talking about cybersecurity, I mean, part of the challenge of the legacy infrastructure is that it's actually impeded the ability to be secure. And so is there an opportunity?
I think the answer to your question is that in a legacy architecture infrastructure environment, it's a really slow process to respond to security issues, right? If you get hacked, it's a very slow process to find it and respond to it. If you're in a dynamic environment that can, you can easily just spin it down or switch to a new server, it's a lot faster to respond to security incidents than on a legacy architecture. And that's really the answer I would give. And the answer to the other question that you asked about being in AWS and the security there, in my mind, it is just another data center. Right? expanded capabilities, and that's how you should think about it. There are only certain controls that you would inherit from that that environment, that cloud environment, and it's only a few. It's only like, I actually created the methodology for that at USCIS, and it was only like 10 or 15 controls that we inherited from our cloud provider. The rest of them is the data owner and the system owner's responsibility to layer on top of those controls. So you are accepting some risk, but you're accepting a lot more risk at your data centers because they're probably a lot less secure, because your cloud providers have a much higher interest in ensuring that you don't get compromised, because they will lose a drastic amount of business, whereas your contractors that are your data integrators are not going to have as big of an issue if something gets compromised at your data center. You're going to take the fall for that, right? And so that's the difference to me.
Neil, can you talk about public-private collaboration with AI for government and industry? Do you think there's an opportunity there?
So there's always opportunity,
Yeah.
right? It's who wants to take the first step on the dance floor, right? So, in my mind, and I can't remember who said this, but, it was the cloud. The definition of cloud is somebody else's computer. That's really the core definition of cloud. So when you look at, for me, when I look at the cloud, I say, what are not your virtual controls, but what are your physical controls? That's really what I ask people when we talk about cloud, is what are your physical controls? How do you access your computer, right? Who can make changes to your computer? Those sort of things, that human element. So when we talk about, AI, the value I see in is, when we talk about, you had mentioned about the amount of data, is that do we really need to take all that data to the cloud, or can we purge it, right? And you look at all those legacy data. So we might have 500 data points. Can we just take the graph, the mathematical function to the cloud as opposed to each individual data point, right? So that's where AI, I see adding value, is looking at all that old data on all the legacy infrastructure and say, what is the information we need to take to the cloud, to the next generation, not what is the data we need to move from one box to another. So,
Michael, given time, do you want to just go to audience questions, and then I'll have Kristen and Nick be able to? Okay, for the time. So, and then I'll give you guys first priority. So we'll open it up to to audience. Well, as my first boss in government said, they can ask me anything they want, but I get to choose which question I want to answer. So you can take any one of those back. Any questions from the audience? You may have your opportunity. Well, I'll give you, and I'll give you a third question, and you can choose which one, because I think in the interest of time, do you think there's an opportunity for Congress to legislate on AI in a way that makes it more effective for government?
Effective for government?
Congress
Wow.
in the same sentence.
I need to be very careful about how I answer this question. I think that Congress is really looking at spending money on AI. I think that I'm stumbling with how to answer this question, just because I've got some insights that I can't go public with. But I think it's an area of interest, and soon, anytime that the government is interested in spending money on something, they're going to be interested in telling us how they want that money spent. So I would expect that, yes, eventually the legislation will catch up with any appropriations that may or may not be coming from the Hill. But can I answer your other
Please.
question about the infrastructure?
Yes.
So architecture is many things, right? You have the pipes, you have the software, you have the storage. And now, because of the emergence of AI, you need high-speed compute capability. And I think a lot of our vendors, Amazon in particular, is starting to be really thoughtful about how much compute they put into the cloud. So in terms of legacy, whether legacy can handle AI, the answer is yes and no. I mean, parts of it can, and those parts will continue to evolve and mature, because our infrastructure, it's an ecosystem. It's always changing, because the different parts of it need to change, from the pipes to the software to the storage to the compute. So I think you can expect that this is an ongoing iterative process where our architectures will continue to evolve as the technology evolves. But anyhow.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, no.
Yeah, I was going to, Nick, you guys are talking a lot about artificial intelligence. I know from your background with the Army before coming over to Pure Storage, what are the changes that you've seen? Because you've now gotten a view from both sides of the house in a lot of ways. How has that changed in the past 5 years? 10 years?
Well, let's say we own an awful lot of what is now considered legacy infrastructure. And the part of the problem with being at war for 17 years is you spend an awful lot of time procuring capability that you need today. And you're dealing with the immediate problems of today, which makes it tremendously difficult to simultaneously invest in the future. What artificial intelligence does computationally is radically different than the classic batch performance and database-driven analytics that we've had in the past. It's actually why we partnered with NVIDIA to build an infrastructure specifically tailored to doing artificial intelligence. The type of computational behavior of neural networks and deep learning algorithms is radically different than the types of computing tasks that we had in the past for which traditional CPU architecture is designed. The throughput, parallelism, and concurrency looks a lot like high-performance computing capability. You have thousands and thousands and thousands, literally dozens of thousands of cores in an NVIDIA DGX-1 or virtually any GPU, but NVIDIA's got probably the best platform on the planet for doing this. All of them are asking questions of the storage and receiving traffic over the network simultaneously. That will run most storage platforms into the ground. So you actually have to literally build capability to support this type of analytics. You can use legacy data sets because data doesn't change, but how we're processing it is tremendously different than how we built computer systems in the past. So I think that that's critically important. We have to actually look at, do we have the tool set necessary to do the computational tasks that we're asking for? And the large majority of cases, it's going to be, no, because it's just a different kind of thing. It's literally going from covered wagons to semi-trucks or jet aircraft.
So extending that analogy, do you worry about ethics in AI? So we have this tendency, it's
Yes.
like with IoT, it was, first to market is more important than secure to market. And now we're in this place of let's get AI out there as quickly as possible, but we're creating algorithms that are impacting human lives. Look at driverless cars, et cetera, et
You're
cetera.
right. And once upon a time, we invented this new technology called fire, and the moment it got away from us, that was bad. And that's the problem with really new, really powerful technologies, is unless we're very, very cognizant of how things could go desperately wrong and work to mitigate that risk, we could wind up with something that can do things that we never envisioned. You see, the difficulty with the difference between specialized AI and generalized AI. A specialized AI is designed to do one thing or a small subset of things exquisitely well. General AIs is what everybody gets afraid of. But frankly, any machine that can learn and learn to make its own decisions as fast as computers can do it could pose some significant risk. And I think that we're short-sighted if we don't think that's true. And we should definitely look at that from our perspective in industry, we have an obligation to engineer those protections into the systems. We really do. Otherwise, we are releasing a terror potentially on unsuspecting users.
And it'll be interesting to see if the legislation aligns with some of that, the way that they're trying to legislate IoT.
It will be interesting indeed.
Do you have a question? Yes.
Sarah, you had mentioned that there is industry's best interest. You had mentioned that performance is in industry's best interest because if they don't perform and they're not secure, they won't get business. My question to the panel in general is, how do you as a government hold industry accountable? Because normally you're left holding the bag. I mean, government has an inherent moral charge. You have a mission. Industry's only mission, really, at the end of the day, is to make money for our shareholders. So how do you, and how do we as individuals take better custodianship of the shared result of these programs?
So I can tell you how I did this at USCIS, and we sort of transformed our contracting process. And instead of buying contracts where I would instill in the contractors, you must build this thing for me and here's all my requirements, I brought them on as partners instead, and I would buy teams. And we led the teams. We made the decisions for the teams. We would work collaboratively to come up with designs and architectures that would work and meet our requirements. And that way, the onus is on us, we to lead and own that responsibility. And so that we ensure that we are going to properly secure and manage what we're building. And that's how we did it at USCIS. I changed the contract strategy like a total 180. Yeah.
She nailed it.
With that, I want to thank the panelists, Kristen St. Peter, Neil Chaudhry, Sarah Fadden, and Nick Psaki. Thank you so much for your time and the thoughtful discussion. Thank you.